Ladies and gentlemen, would you please rise for the playing of our national anthem?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible.
If you think the government derives its just powers from your consent, you're about to learn something. Consent of the governed is clown shoes. How was that for an intro?
That, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most to affect their safety and happiness.
How many times have you heard that piece of the Declaration of Independence? How many people really even understand it? Most people take it to mean that they should just make extra sure to cast their ballot extra hard the next time the slave suggestion box is open. The experts will tell you that consent of the governed refers to the idea that a government's legitimacy and moral right to initiate the use of force inside its geographical area is only justified, legal, and moral when it's consented to by the people within that area. You're about to learn why the experts are wrong and the masses are dumb. I mean, the masses are stupid. Fooled. The masses are fooled. I meant to say the masses have been fooled. And they're dumb. When we're talking about this stuff, you'll usually find me pointing out that consent is a sacred, personal, and individual act. Something that can be withdrawn at any time, that is both logically and practically impossible to garner from a group of people much larger than a few friends deciding where to have dinner. You'll also find me talking about how consent is morality. How morality can almost never exist in the absence of consent. You will also find me making the case that government is a mere concept with no actual tangible existence. Only those that work towards its ends, those who vote and participate with it, those who enforce its laws, and those subjected to its control actually exist. Right now, though, I'm about to destroy the phrase itself by showing you that it's a hopeless contradiction. Consent of the governed. Let's actually look at the two meaningful words in play here. Consent and governed. Let's start with governed. To govern
is to control, influence, or regulate a person, action, or course of events.
Yes. And government is the system
Government is the system by which a state or community is controlled.
The word that both of those definitions have in common is control. So what's control mean? To control someone is to direct.
To control someone is to direct the behavior of a person, to cause them to do what you want.
Yes. So, government is control. And to be governed is to be controlled. This isn't really rocket science, right? I mean, we all understand that the purpose of voting is to affect how government controls the people and resources in the country. In fact, a government without control would be completely useless. Without control, it couldn't tax, it couldn't regulate, arrest criminals, it couldn't raise a standing army, and it couldn't attack a foreign or domestic enemy. There would be no point at all in voting because if the government could not act, if the government had no agency, voting would not only be pointless, but actually a little bit crazy. Voting would become the same thing as you sitting at home watching Game of Thrones, yelling at your TV, thinking you'll be able to actually save Ned Stark's life.
Spoiler alert!
Sorry. All right. Let's put aside for the moment that voting is actually a lot like yelling at your TV, plus some other terrible moral implications, and instead examine another word I just used, one of my favorite all-time words, agency. Agency is the
capacity to act or to exert power.
Without agency, you become exactly like your TV. You have no more ability to affect your life or the world around you than a guy in a coma does. Without agency, you have no ability to act, to decide, to control yourself, your life, or your property. The difference between a man with agency and a man without agency is that one is free and the other is a slave. In many ways, to have agency is to exist, and to have your agency stolen from you is to be denied your existence. Agency is also the capacity to consent. And that brings us to the other operative word in our phrase, consent. This one's pretty simple. Consent is a person's permission agreement for something to happen. So agency is our capacity to grant or to deny permission for something to happen. All right, let's bring it all together. To govern is to control. To be governed is to be controlled. To be controlled is to have your agency removed. To have your agency removed is to be robbed of your ability to consent. That makes control the antithesis of consent. When you are truly in a state of being controlled, you are in a state where you do not even have the capacity, the ability to consent. Government is control. Therefore, government removes agency. Therefore, government removes even the possibility of consent. Therefore, to be governed is to be held in a state of null consent, a state where even if you wanted to, you could not consent. So to say that government exists through the consent of the governed is not only false, but it's logically contradictory. If government required the consent of its population to exist, it would be an insurmountable self-detonating paradox.
Paradox! A statement or proposition that contradicts itself in a baffling way, leading to a conclusion that seems senseless, logically unacceptable, or self-contradictory.
Wasn't really looking for that definition, but thanks.
My spleen hurts.
So, a government requiring consent would be an insurmountable self-detonating paradox because a population in a state of being controlled lacks the capacity to provide that requisite consent. This fundamental contradiction is highlighted even further when people build on this idea by saying that those that live in a country tacitly consent to being controlled by that country's government. This is the same crap argument you'll hear all the time when people say stuff like,
hey! If you don't like it here, why don't you get the hell out then, huh?
Exactly.
Freaking right.
I always enjoy hearing #Americans tell me that if I want more freedom, I need to leave America. I just think that's fun. But anyway, it is a fallacy of circular reasoning to both say that if you live here, you consent to be governed by the state, and at the same time also say that the state exists because of your consent. So either you consent to the government by living here, or the government exists because you consent to it. And neither of those arguments actually work anyway, because once you're governed, you can no longer consent to it. That's why this topic is so important for people to understand. So to summarize, you cannot consent to be governed because the moment you are governed, you lose the ability to consent to it. That's not to say that you can't consent to follow a certain set of rules. What I am saying, though, is that if you do consent to follow a certain set of rules, you're not being controlled and you're not being governed. You're voluntarily acting according to your consensual agreements, and you retain the ability to withdraw your consent at any time. One guy I had this conversation with thought he had me tripped up by referring to control in a purely physical sense, saying, for example, that if the two of us were engaged in a consensual arm wrestling match and he was winning, that he had both my consent and control of my arm. This, he said, served to show that I can in fact consent to being controlled. He also gave the example of two people engaged in consensual rough sex. If one person consents to allow another person to tie them to a table and spank them, then again he has shown it's possible to consent to being controlled. First of all, we're not having a physics discussion about the forces exerted on people's bodies. We're having a philosophical discussion on the ethics of consent and the definitions of government and control and agency. It's the difference between a discussion on a television's ability to control the rays of light emitted from it and a discussion on what makes a person free or a slave. That said, I'm going to take a crack at it anyway. Without a deep understanding of consent, both of these examples appear to disprove my argument. However, both examples place the person in a situation of faux control, meaning that both the arm wrestler and the person strapped to the table still actually retain their agency, their ability to withdraw consent, to say no, stop the situation, and end the encounter. If the arm wrestler surrendered the match and said that he wished to leave, his opponent would have to allow him to do so. If the person strapped to the table signaled that they no longer consented and wished to be released, their partner in the situation would be required to release them immediately. This is because in both situations, the controlled still in reality retain their agency. To correct both of these examples, you could say that the arm wrestler did say that he wished to stop and leave but wasn't allowed to. Say his opponent, with his other hand, put a gun to the guy's head and told him he had to finish the match or else. Suppose the person strapped to the table signaled their wish to end the encounter, but their partner refused to let them up and continued against the person's wishes. Now the analogies match the discussion. Both the arm wrestling opponent and the dominant partner have real control because they've removed the agency from the victim. They have become the governor and the other the subject. Bottom line, if you have the ability to consent to being controlled by something or someone, you're not actually being controlled by them. But the governed can never consent. Voting provides for a grand illusion. It makes the masses feel like they're in control. The truth is the same as it was for our dominant and for our arm wrestler. It's merely faux control, meant to keep you from realizing that your agency has, in reality, been stripped from you. Your capacity to consent removed. Your means to act to exert self-control gone. You are a slave raised as livestock, living for the benefit and at the pleasure of others. If you still think that the government exists through the power of your consent, try revoking it sometime. See what happens. Thanks.